Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are doing well. So as I said, I'm going to try to get these videos up as soon as possible so that if students have extra free time, which it seems like a lot of us have more free time than we know what to do with right now, if you would like to work ahead, that's fine. So at the time that I'm recording this video, it's March 24th when I'm recording this, so at this point in time, you have Activity 9 that's going to be due by 5 p.m. on Friday, March 27th. Many of you have already completed this, but don't forget that. Also, Exam 3 is open now, and it's going to close at 5 p.m. on March 31st. You will have 75 minutes to take the test, so the same amount of time you would have if you were taking it in the classroom. For students who receive accommodations, I've added the extra time and a half in there for you as well. Let me know if you have any questions about that. One thing that I think I mentioned before is that Canvas does not let me do the opinion questions the same way that I do them in class. So there are 2 opinion questions in the test, but I can't set them to give you full credit initially. So some of you will get that credit the first time just because you'll click on the answer that's selected as the right answer. Some of you won't get that credit right away, but everyone will end up with that credit after the exam closes. I'll go back and set it to give full credit for those questions then. So you might see your grade go up a little bit after Exam 3 closes, okay? This lecture video that I'm recording today is going to be for the week of March 30th. So this is going to be about communication. This is going to be the first lecture for the last section of the class. So after this lecture, we'll have a lecture on commitment and on staying together before we have Exam 4. One other thing to say is that I am recording this video for both my morning and afternoon classes. The schedule I have pulled up right this second is for my 9:30 section. So that doesn't make any difference except for the final exam period. So this is the final exam period for my 9:30 section, but then for my 2 o'clock section, it's going to be different. So make sure you don't get confused on that. You can find your schedule for your section posted on Canvas. But let me know if you have any questions. Alright, also one other thing is that the activities are open now. All the activities are open. So many of you have been working ahead on the activities. That's great. You don't have to do that. Just make sure you submit them before they're due. But if you have free time and want to work ahead, that's great. Also, you do get 2 drop grades for activities. So if you've already gotten credit for 10 activities, then you don't have to do the last 2. Okay, so let me know if you have questions about that. I'm going to automatically drop your 2 lowest activity grades. Alright, so this set of slides is on communication, and it seems really unfortunate that I have to have this conversation with my computer instead of with you guys. This is a really enjoyable lecture to have in class, and one that I wish we could, but we're doing the best that we can with this. So, first of all, when it comes to communication specific to romantic relationships, we have this interpersonal gap that's going to be an issue. The best way I can think of to describe this is the telephone game that we play sometimes when we're kids, right? I don't know if any of you guys remember playing telephone. In this current generation, maybe you actually had a telephone when you were a kid, but that's a whole nother conversation. But the idea is you sit in a circle and someone thinks of a message and whispers it to the next person, who then whispers it to the next person, and it goes all the way around the circle until you get back to the first person. And oftentimes, the message that you end up with is very different from the message you started with. And maybe that's because someone intentionally changes the message, thinks that it's funny. But it's also possible that you mishear, you don't understand what the person's saying. So interpersonal gap is really demonstrated in that children's game. But it's also something that we see in our relationships. So we have the sender's intentions, what it is that you want to say. And you know what you want to say. But that's personal and private to you, and you have to find a way to express that so that the listener can understand. When you have an interpersonal gap, the message that you're trying to send and the message that the listener is receiving are not the same message. So there are several reasons why this could be. So we're going to start off over here with the sender's intention. So this is private. You know what you want to say. It's your job to express that clearly. Here we have the effect on the listener. This is once again private. You're the one who understands what you've heard and what you're making of it. So how do we get from what one person is trying to say to what another person is hearing? Well, we're going to talk about some tips later in this set of slides about how to clearly communicate what you're trying to say. But it can be difficult. First of all, noise and interference. Some of us are more distracted by things in the environment than others. Certainly, I know that I can be really impacted by distractions in the environment. So if you're in a noisy place, which right now this is not the case, but assuming that we're not having a coronavirus problem, if you're on campus, you're in the union, and there's noise and things going on in the background, that can be really distracting. Or if the television is on, that kind of thing. Or if you're looking at your phone, looking at Facebook. All those things would count as noise and interference that could be impacting the person speaking and or the person listening. Okay, so making sure that we're having this conversation in a quiet place where we're distraction free, put down the phones, all of that is important. Okay. Also, you have to think about the sender's style of encoding. So if you're the speaker, what is your style of communicating whatever it is that you want to say? I think that this is individual. Some people have more forceful personalities or more outgoing personalities versus some people that tend to be a little bit more quiet or a little bit more introverted. But I also think that this has to do with social norms. I think in the South, we tend to be very cautious about the way we say things. We tend to be more passive-aggressive, if anything, rather than being directly aggressive. We tend to avoid confrontation. So sometimes a person might not come out and say exactly what they're thinking because we've been raised to be polite, which I think there is a way to say what you're thinking and still be polite, usually. But once again, you have to be cautious. But then there's also the listener's style of decoding, which could be impacted by your personality, could be impacted by the culture you live in, but I think it could also be impacted by past relationships. If you've had a partner in the past that's been very critical, that might make you a little bit more sensitive to what your partner may or may not be saying, okay? In addition to all of this, we have to take into account the sender's actions. So how close are you standing to the person you're talking to? Are you making eye contact? We're going to talk more about some of these things coming up, but that can also be part of the way that you communicate information. So an interpersonal gap happens when what the speaker is trying to say and what the listener is hearing are not the same message. Okay, and we'll talk later about how to make sure that that's not happening as well. So if we're going to have a set of slides on communication, we also need to think about the difference between verbal and nonverbal communication. So verbal communication is going to be the actual content of your words. Everything else is nonverbal. So there are some things that I just mentioned a second ago, and we'll mention more coming up, like how close you stand to another person, body language, eye contact, touch, that kind of thing. All those would be nonverbal. But also, think about the sound, the tone of voice a person uses. That's also nonverbal. It sounds kind of strange, but it's not what they're saying, it's how they're saying it. So sometimes individuals are just naturally sarcastic, right? Or maybe you're having a bad day and the sarcasm slips out. But think about certain phrases that could mean different things depending on how a person said them. So the difference between I'm fine and I'm fine. You can tell there's a little bit of a difference there. Or the I'm so happy for you. I tell this story every semester, but I'm not a naturally sarcastic person. I hope you guys picked up on my personality by now. But there was a day when they lost my paperwork. I was supposed to be graduating with my master's degree, and I was going to be starting a job teaching like a couple of days after I got my master's degree. And they lost my paperwork, and they told me that I might not graduate. And I got really upset. And then I walked downstairs and ran into a member of my cohort, and she was like, "Oh, look, I got my diploma." And my reaction was, "Well, I'm so happy for you," which, of course, probably seemed very harsh coming from me because I tend to not be a harsh person, but then I had to apologize, right? It was just a hard day. But the way that you say something is not verbal, it's nonverbal. Your verbal communication is exactly the content of what you're saying, but the way you say it is nonverbal. In addition to, are you talking with your hands? What are your behaviors? So this leads into Activity 10, which some of you have already completed and have some really good ideas on this. Activity 10 is going to try to get at the relational side of nonverbal communication. So what I asked you to do is to think about how you might be able to tell if a person is romantically interested in you. I think I included that in what I put in Canvas, but when I say interested, I'm talking about a person's flirting with you here. Now, this is one of those, again, where I like having this in class so we can have this conversation. But, we're doing the best that we can here. Students will often give me some really good ideas, but then as they list them, I'll ask the question, okay, does that definitely mean that someone is flirting with you? Like, for example, if a person makes a lot of eye contact with you, That could mean they're flirting with you, but that could just be their personal style. They're trying to show that they're paying attention. Or they come from a different place with different social norms. It could be that a person's smiling a lot and you think, okay, this person must be flirting with me, but maybe not. Maybe they just are a person that smiles a lot. So my purpose in this activity is to get your thoughts on it, and also to demonstrate the fact that there's no one perfect way to demonstrate in a nonverbal manner that you're interested in another person. Really, if you want to know for sure, does this person like me, really the verbal content is what you need. You need a person to say, yes, I like you, let's do dinner. But then the discussion turns to, do we usually do that? If we're romantically interested in someone, do we usually just come right out and say, hey, I like you, do you want to go on a date? And then students usually say, no, that's not what we typically do. Maybe because we're worried about rejection, we're trying to get some ideas about if the person likes us back before we make that step, that kind of thing. So I think that verbal communication can be more straightforward. Nonverbal can be harder to read. But of course, with verbal communication, a person could be lying, could be intentionally misleading you. Versus, some people might say, well, it's harder to fake the nonverbal. I don't know how much control you have over your facial expressions. We're going to talk more about that coming up. But for some people, it's really hard for them to hide what they're feeling and thinking. Even if they can lie with the words they're using, it's still pretty easy to tell. All right, so let's talk about some different types of nonverbal communication. First of all, facial expressions. Let's take it easy on this individual. If someone came up to you with a camera and said, hey, make an angry face, make a scared face, make a sad face, you don't know what your face would look like, okay? This would be really challenging to do. But what they're saying here is that you don't know this woman, and you don't even know what culture she's from. She may have been raised in a very different culture from us, and yet you can probably tell what she's feeling, right? So this is clearly happy, this is clearly sad. I would say this is like scared. I would say probably scared, not panicked, but scared, maybe surprised, shocked a little bit here. So the question then is, how can you tell what she's feeling when you don't know this person and you don't even know what culture she's from? You may not even speak the same language. Well, facial expressions are to a certain extent universal. They're not completely universal, but they are to a certain extent universal. So there are basic emotions, the ones that develop really early on, like happiness. You think about a baby. A baby can be happy. A baby can be sad. A baby can be disgusted, right? Try to feed a baby green beans in a jar. Baby can be disgusted. Baby can be angry. Trust me, baby can be angry. So these emotions that develop very early on, usually those facial expressions are pretty consistent across the world. But there are some emotions that are a little more complex that develop later. Things like embarrassment or pride. In order to be embarrassed or proud, you have to have an understanding of social norms. What am I supposed to be doing? And am I doing really well, or am I not doing really well? So because of the more complex nature of some emotions, they may differ from culture to culture. Different cultures handle those complex emotions, or secondary emotions, I guess is a better term, a little bit more differently. But in most cultures, happiness, sadness, anger are handled pretty similarly and have similar facial expressions. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys that you need to learn how to control your facial expressions, okay? And just as a tip, your professors can see your face. Not right now. Once again, people misunderstand psychology. I can't read your mind. I don't know what you're doing right now. But when we're in the classroom, people sometimes forget that I'm looking at you just like you're looking at me. I can see the faces you're making or how much you're on your phone, so just be aware of that. But you need to learn how to control your facial expressions. Let's think about some times where that could be really important. What if you're a parent and you want to be cautious not to reward bad behavior even if it's funny? There was one particular situation. Am I going to put this on the internet? Yeah, I guess so. I've already started this conversation, so I guess I will. Where my son cursed in the car, turned to my daughter, and yeah, what are the odds that anybody I know is watching this video? Very little, beside my student. Anyway, I'll just go ahead and tell the story. I wasn't there. My husband was in the car, but my son turned to my daughter and said, "Are you shitting me?" Okay, now, my kid is 8 at this point. And before you start judging me, I'm a decent parent. But what had happened was I let my kids watch the Spider-Man Homecoming movie, and that's where we had picked that up. So, I asked my husband, like, first of all, I reacted like panic, like, oh no, that's funny when some other kid says that. It's not funny when my kid says that. But then the other thing I responded was, how did you react to him? And my husband was like, I just told him we don't say that. That's not a good word. And just ignored it. And I'm like, yes, good, thank you. Because if you laugh, or even if you act overly horrified, they'll learn that they can get a reaction out of you from that. So you have to keep your face straight when your kid starts cursing, okay? Other things, what if you're a psychologist? What if your client says something that shocks you? If you show that you're shocked, or if you show that you're angered, like your client may say something that makes you angry. If you show that, then you might break the trust and the rapport that you have with your client. Your client may not come back. Also, if you're a psychologist, if you're doing an assessment, you're supposed to give an intelligence test with the same blank expression the entire time. You can't show them when they're getting answers right or when they're getting answers wrong, because then it's not standardized. Then they get nervous or overconfident, and you might as well stop giving the test. You've already messed it up. So you have to learn how to have a blank expression, right? Now, that would be neutralizing your facial expression, okay? You're withholding your poker face. I'm not going to sing it, but you get the idea, your poker face. There may be times when you intensify or exaggerate your facial expressions. Like if somebody made a joke and it wasn't that funny, but it was a little bit funny, or you want them to feel good, you laugh at their joke even if you don't really feel like laughing, you kind of intensify that. Or minimize that, lessening it. Like maybe you're really upset, but you feel like it's not appropriate for me to be really upset in this particular situation with my boss or whatever. So you show some of what you're feeling, but not all of what you're feeling, perhaps. As I said, neutralizing would just be withholding, poker face, right? But then masking would be replacing your facial expression with a facial expression that doesn't go along with what you're feeling. For example, what if you're at a funeral, but it's not a person you know really well? And maybe you're happy, maybe you're having a really good day, but you put on a sad face because you want to be respectful. Like that's the social norms, right? That goes along with our display rules. Our culture tells us what emotions we should show in certain situations, right? There are social norms for what you should do in that particular situation. Or what if you're having a terrible day, but your roommate just got engaged or just got into grad school or something and is really excited, and so you put on a happy face because you're trying to be supportive of the person you care about, right? That would be masking. So as I said, we have certain expressions in our culture that we consider acceptable or not acceptable depending on the situation. One example here is that we have differences in display rules for men and women. So we tend to think of women as being more emotional, and we expect women to be more emotional. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Holiday with Cameron Diaz, but the basic idea is that she has a really hard time crying. She doesn't really show a lot of emotion, and that's something that has maybe impacted her relationships a little bit. Something we consider strange. But then on the other hand, we tend to expect men to not show emotions. We have this stereotype of this stoic man who, if he feels anything, doesn't express it. Now, that's kind of what our culture puts forth. But then let me ask the question, is that really what we want? Do we want a culture of men who are unable to express emotions? And what kind of problems can come up with that? And what types of psychological issues will we have if men feel like they can't go to therapy because they're expected to not have emotions or to control them themselves? So something to bear in mind here is that sometimes our cultural norms are not really helpful, and maybe something we should consider trying to change, right? All right, in addition to facial expressions, we also have gazing behavior, so eye contact. The thing about these cultural norms or social norms is that we're not given a handbook at birth. How do we know what's considered okay and not okay? Well, two things. One, we learn from our parents. So the parents will say, stop staring at that person, or look me in the eye when I'm talking to you. Like your parents teach you that, but or other caregivers, teachers, grandparents, etc. But also we learn from trial and error, okay? It's reinforcement and punishment. When we make a mistake, we get punished for that. When we make eye contact that's weird or creepy or not appropriate, then people, maybe they say, hey, stop looking at me, that kind of thing. Or maybe they just stop seeking out your company. So because of that, we get punished when we mess these things up. We get rewarded when we get these things right. And through all of that, we learn, more or less. So when we're talking about eye contact, there's something I always do every semester, and I can't do it now, which is unfortunate, but I'll ask a student to volunteer, and I'll say, I'm not going to make you do anything, just volunteer. Somebody volunteers, and I might make intense eye contact with a student. And I say, okay, I'm going to make eye contact with you until this gets weird. And it doesn't take long. I mean, 5 seconds in, at least that person is giggling, usually. And other people in the classroom start giggling because it's awkward and uncomfortable. Why is it awkward and uncomfortable? It goes against our social norms. So, although maybe you guys are glad that that creepy activity is not happening, the idea, though, is to demonstrate how strange it can get really quickly when a person doesn't know the social norms. Now, one thing here, it talks about strangers gazing into each other's eyes and liking each other. Let me clarify that. That's research where they are told, okay, you have to stare into this person's eyes. Hey, this person has to stare into your eyes. They know why they're staring into each other's eyes. They're staring into each other's eyes because the researcher told them to. And that made them like each other more. But if you just follow somebody around and make intense eye contact with them, I'm not suggesting that that's going to make them like you more. That might backfire for you, okay? All right, eye contact. In addition, touch. I'm going to encourage you to be very cautious with this. First of all, it's coronavirus season, right? I don't know if this is going to be a thing. We're going to have seasons. But anyway, so definitely keep your distance, right? 6 feet at least or so. But even when we're not having some type of public health epidemic, we should still be cautious with how we use touch. Some people are just naturally huggers, and some people are not. So then if I was able to ask you this question, I would ask, how do you fend off the hugger if you don't want to be hugged? In a way that's not rude. And we could have that conversation. You go in for a fist bump or a bro hug or, you know, I don't know. I guess today you just cough and people would run away. But the idea is some people don't like to be touched and some people do. Now, you can communicate different things just by touching someone. It talks about like sympathy, you know, like a pat on the back, like you touch someone's arm, like I'm here for you, you know, or anger, like grabbing somebody. Disgust, maybe like pushing something away. So there are different nuances to touch. This also makes me think about Hitch. I don't know if that movie is too old for you guys to have seen it. I'm going to continue with my obscure movie references, but a guy that's known as like the matchmaker that helps people get into relationships with the people they like. Anyway, having a conversation about where do you put your hand on someone's back, and is there a friend zone versus, yeah, there's like there's a right place to put your hand, that kind of thing is what we're getting at. Now, with all of these social norms, I want to encourage you, first of all, travel's not encouraged right now. Throwing that out there. But in the future, when you travel, I want to encourage you to be cautious. Before you travel, you should really look up social norms of the place you're going. And don't think that just because you're traveling within the United States, you're good. There are different social norms in different parts of the country, right? So being aware of that. But eye contact and how close you stand to another person we're about to talk about, these things probably differ from culture to culture. And maybe from time period to time period, generation to generation. So, personal space. This is where I ask if anybody has their story about weird interactions at Kroger, that kind of thing. So how close should you stand to another person? Another way to get at this is if you're walking into a waiting room. Now, just take the coronavirus out of this for a second, okay? Because I know everybody's trying to keep their distance now. I get that. But take that out of the equation. If you walk into a doctor's office and there's one other person in the waiting room, where do you sit? You probably try to sit as far as possible away from that person. Not a doctor's office. Some of you are like, oh, somebody might be sick. But what about in a movie theater? If you walk into a movie theater and there's only one other person there, do you go sit right next to them? Not if you don't know them. That's okay. But there are social norms about how close you get to other people. Okay. So, intimate zone. This is the area within 1.5 feet of the front of our chest. Who comes into our intimate zone? Only the people who are invited, right? So be very cautious with that. Maybe you know the person that doesn't understand these cues. Maybe this is something that you might use as a sign that a person is interested if they stand close to you. Maybe you're the person that backs away. Like a person steps towards you and you take a step back. But then they take another step towards you and you take another step back. I'm going to encourage you to make sure you're backing towards the door and not backing into a corner. Also, one other thing I'm throwing out there, they may or may not teach you this. I'm sure at some point if you're going to see clients, somebody will teach you this. But just be aware, if you're seeing a client, you set up the room before they get there the way you want it, okay? Make sure that you are closer to the door than your client, okay? I never had a client threaten me, but you have to think about how you're going to defend yourself in a way that's not going to get you, it's not inappropriate, but a way that's not going to get you sued or that kind of thing. So you want to make sure that you're closer to the door than your client. I don't say that to scare you. I just say it's a practical consideration, right? Also, make sure you're backing towards the door if somebody's in your personal space, right? Okay. Sorry, bit of a tangent there, but I think relevant. All right, personal zone. This is where we have interactions with friends and acquaintances. At this point, it could start to feel weird if a person is too far away. If you're trying to have a conversation with them, especially an important conversation, an intimate conversation, you don't want to have to shout that. So you want to be not too close, not too far away. Social zone, where you have like business-like interactions. How close do you stand to your boss? That kind of thing. How close does a professor stand to their students when lecturing? Yeah, that might wander between the social zone and the public zone. That might be a little bit farther away. But we have some social norms about how close we stand to other people. And we usually relax these norms with kids because we think, well, kids haven't understood this yet. Some kids don't understand personal space and they stand very close to other people. But once again, that's where parents come in and provide correction. All right, good. Another thing about nonverbal communication is that you tend to synchronize your nonverbal behavior with the people that you're around. So you may have noticed this, but if other people talk with their hands, maybe you start talking with your hands. If other people use certain accents, I don't know if you've ever caught yourself picking up an accent. If you have someone in your family or one of your friends that has an accent, I know a lovely lady, wonderful lady from Australia. I don't think I've picked up any of her accent talking to her, but I wish I could because it sounds so cool. But anyway, the idea is that you tend to mimic the people that you're having conversations with, and when this mimicry happens, people tend to report enjoying that conversation. It's like you're focusing on the things you have in common and trying to make yourself more like the person you're talking to. And that makes that conversation more pleasurable for both of you. So, one thing to be aware of here then is that you might not be noticing that this is happening. You might start to behave like the people you spend time around. Now, take a pause and look at the people you spend time around and think, do I want to behave like those people? And then consider that, okay? That's all the advice I'm giving on that particular subject. I'm sure I'll give more. Now, what about specifically with romantic couples? Verbal communication is important. We're going to talk more about that coming up. How do you say what you mean to say? But let's think about nonverbal communication. The accuracy with which couples communicate nonverbally is a really great predictor of how happy they are in their relationships. Why is that? Well, let's just think about a situation where you're in public with your partner. Your partner might want to communicate something to you that they don't want to tell everybody else. How accurate can you be reading their signs? Telling, is this person ready to go, for example? Does this person need a break from all the socialization, get me away from my family members, that kind of thing, okay? Being able to read each other. I'm going to go ahead and say that I think this is my favorite part of being married. Like, my husband and I have been married for over 10 years now, and I love this, that when we're out, when other people are around, and something happens, he and I can look at each other, and I know what he's thinking, and he knows what I'm thinking. Like, I think to myself, we're going to talk about that later, or we're going to laugh about that later. Like, that's something that I really enjoy. But you can also see how, especially early on in relationship, it can be really hard to understand another person's nonverbal communication because it may be different from yours and different from other people that you spent time around. Now, this sounds really awful here, but men are more likely than women to have problems communicating clearly, especially nonverbal communication. And so what it says here is that when these problems occur, it's usually the husband's fault. Well, the terminology here is sort of assuming that we're talking about a heterosexual couple, but I think this could apply to a lot of couples as well. What we're saying here is that women are more likely to put more effort towards especially nonverbal communication and reading other people's nonverbal signs than men are. And when you ask the question about why that might be, we see that women are perhaps socialized to do this. So it's the nature-nurture question. From the nurture side of things, I think from a young age, we spend more time talking to girls than we do boys. We spend more time signing girls up for activities that involve more communication, teamwork, cooperation, that kind of thing, whereas we tend to treat boys as more like individualistic, like you go be the best, go beat, and more of individual things. So I think if you look at the games that little girls play, maybe they play like teacher, that kind of thing, and they're talking to another person, then perhaps we're practicing from a young age and maybe being reinforced from a young age. I'm not suggesting that it's wrong to teach young girls how to communicate. I'm suggesting that we need to make sure we teach boys how to communicate as well, making sure that we're doing that. But then it could also be a nature side of things. Women tend to do better on verbal tasks, on like standardized tests, that kind of thing. But once again, is that because women are naturally better at verbal tasks, or because they've been socialized, or probably some of both? So what I would say is that it is very likely if the couple's not happy, they're both making mistakes, regardless of what type of relationship. We're talking about gay, lesbian, heterosexual, whatever. There are probably mistakes being made by every partner. But it may be that men might need a little bit more direct training in nonverbal communication, or just having it brought to their attention that nonverbal communication is really important. Might need that a little bit more than women do, because maybe they haven't gotten it. Now, if we switch from nonverbal communication to verbal communication, that's the actual content of what we're saying, the words that we're using. So several different topics that could fall in this category. Self-disclosure is the process of revealing information that you don't share with everyone. So back at the beginning of the class, like the first day of lecture, we had this conversation about the different components of intimacy. And we said that knowledge was one of those. So you're in an intimate relationship if you have shared personal knowledge, personal information with another person, and they've shared that with you. And that shows that they trust you, that they're committed. So you're probably not going to share personal, private information with someone that you don't think you're going to be with for a while. So it's a really important step in a relationship. You really can't say that you're close to a person if they haven't shared something with you. Of course, then, that means that it's hard to have relationships with people who don't share anything. Some people have had bad experiences, or it's just naturally their personality to be very private. And so it may be hard to gauge how intimate the relationship is if those deeper conversations haven't happened yet. But then also, if you're in a relationship with someone who shares everything with everyone, if everything they're thinking and feeling gets put on Facebook, then it feels like they're in an intimate relationship with everyone on their Facebook. Like, how do you know that your relationship is special and different? So we should be very careful with how we use self-disclosure. So with self-disclosure, there are some topics that we just don't bring up until later in a relationship, or some topics that we only maybe touch on the very surface level early on in a relationship. So social penetration theory suggests that as you become closer to your partner, you will talk about more topics, and you will talk about those topics more deeply. So first of all, the breadth of topics. So what I would ask if we were in class would be, what sort of topics do you tend to avoid in the beginning of a relationship? So you might talk about past relationships, or about early childhood experiences. For some of you, that might just be like, that's just not on the table. I don't want to talk about my family, or whatever the topics are to you that you're not comfortable talking about yet. But then, if you're in this relationship for a while, it becomes more committed, there's more intimacy, then you might be willing to share on those topics. There may be some topics that you're willing to talk about a little bit. Maybe you're willing to tell a little bit about your family, but you don't want to go into any great detail. Or maybe even talking a little bit about previous relationships, but not going into any great detail until later in the relationship. So one thing to think about is that as a relationship continues and you have more intimacy and you have more commitment, it may feel like there's a point where we've had all these conversations. We've talked about every topic, and we've talked about it at length. And what do we do then? And is that a sign that our relationship is in danger? Well, not necessarily. I would say that you need to expand. Take up a new hobby. Talk to some new people. watch a new movie. I don't know, do something new together or individually and then come together and talk about it. Continuing to have conversations is really, really important. Okay. Now, reciprocity can be tricky here when it comes to self-disclosure. When we're talking about reciprocity, it means responding in kind. So when a partner shares something personal with you, they expect you to do two things. One, they expect you to listen, to care, to show that you're invested. But then two, at least at some point, they're going to expect you to then share something with them. So as your partner trusts you with information, they're going to expect and want you to trust them with information as well. One thing that I think about with reciprocity here, and I think we've mentioned this when we talked about love and the different types of love, but how do you feel about a relationship? A partner might do something to indicate that they really care. Maybe it's saying, I love you, or talking about the future, or that kind of thing. They're expecting you to reciprocate, to do the same thing, for you to say that you love them too. So that's a tricky situation if you're not quite there yet. But just being honest and saying, you know, I really like you, but maybe I'm not quite there yet, but maybe we'll get there. I don't know. I don't have all the answers. Don't let me give you the impression that I have all the answers. All right, good. So the idea is that you can build up your relationship with self-disclosure by responding correctly. But then, by the same token, you can tear down a relationship by responding incorrectly. If your partner tells you about a trauma, about a fear, an anxiety, they expect you to listen, to pay attention, to care, and then to respond to that. Like, if my partner is concerned about finances, let me make sure I remember that. Let me make sure that I do something to help my partner. Maybe there's something we can do, make a budget, reduce what we're spending, whatever, to make your partner know that I listened and I'm responding. By the same token, though, if your partner expresses something, I'm really upset about this, I'm really afraid about this, and you don't pay attention, you don't act like you care, or you act like you care, but then you don't behave as if you really heard them, then that can tear down a relationship. So look at that as an opportunity to build up the relationship when your partner shares something with you. They're going to expect you to respond in the appropriate way. So their perception of how you respond is really going to impact their level of satisfaction in the relationship. So make sure that your partner knows that you're listening. And we'll talk later about how to make sure that you communicate that you're listening and how to make sure that your partner is accurately understanding you. So that's going to come up. Nevertheless, there will be likely some taboo topics. And this may be even in couples that have been together for a while. I think the longer you've been together, probably the fewer taboo topics you would have. But then again, maybe not. It depends on the couple. So a taboo topic would be a topic that you have either explicitly, out loud, said, hey, you know what? I don't think we should talk about this. Or implicitly, like every time we've talked about this, it hasn't gone well, so I'm just going to not bring that up. Now, there are some topics that it's okay to do this with, right? If you and your partner disagree about politics, I mean, it depends on how important you think politics is and how big of a difference it is. But maybe we could just say, you know what? Let's just don't talk about politics, you know? Or every time we talk about your family, we get in a fight, maybe we just don't need to talk about your family very much unless it's necessary. Maybe you can do that. There may be some topics, though, that just shouldn't be taboo topics. We talked in the sexuality slides about communication, about sexual issues, and about how couples often don't talk about them, but maybe they should. Another thing here is money. I have heard couples where one partner will say, I just don't like talking about money, so let's just don't worry about money. But I think that not being aware of where you stand financially could lead to bigger problems that are going to have to be addressed. Maybe it would be better to face that. So you and your partner have to decide what is and what is not a taboo topic. One of the most common taboo topics is the state of the relationship. You think about the state of the union kind of thing here. So are we going to get engaged? Are we going to move in together? Are we going to get married? Are we going to stay married? That kind of thing. Okay, that's often a difficult conversation to have. Maybe you're not sure that your partner is thinking the same things you are. We're afraid to make ourselves vulnerable, right? Okay, now, this is important for today's day and time, okay? Self-disclosure is good for us. It may be hard, especially if you're in quarantine and you don't have other people around or you have a limited number of people around. Still call people. talk to people, find somebody to talk to. Self-disclosure is good for us. So if you were in the classroom, I would ask you, at the time that I'm recording this, it's like 3:13. That's what time my clock says right now. 3:13. Okay. Well, at p.m., by the way. I'm not up in the morning. I am sometimes up at 3:13 in the morning. I've told you about my toddler, but 3:13 in the afternoon. Okay. I might say, how many serious, meaningful conversations have you had today? And usually in the classroom, my students will say, not many. Maybe we've talked about the weather. We've talked about sports. We've talked about, sports aren't even happening right now. But I mean, in a normal semester, students would say, you know, I've talked about what classes I'm going to take and that kind of thing. But maybe we haven't talked about anything that matters. Maybe we need to be careful to make sure that we do set aside some time to talk about things that are important to us. And to listen when other people want to share that information with us as well. All right, now, gender differences in verbal communication. We've already said that men tend to be less sensitive to nonverbal signs, although once again, that's a generalization. So while that may be true for men in general, that's not necessarily true for any particular man or women. You know, not every woman is good at communicating also. But we do tend to see some differences when we ask people on a survey, how do you communicate? Women tend to say that they gossip and they talk about their feelings. Okay, first of all, I do think this is partially true. I do think women are more likely to talk about their feelings, and I think that that's because we're socialized to do so. I also, hate me if you will, I'd prefer you didn't, but if that's what you want to do, go ahead. I think women do gossip more, but I think men do gossip, but I think they gossip in a different way than women. I think it also depends on, like, we're taught different styles of aggression. Men tend to be more physically aggressive, but women tend to be more relationally aggressive. And so gossip might be a form of relational aggression. But anyway, I do think men do gossip some. But I think women do perhaps tend to be more gossipy than others. At least that's what we say on a survey. Okay. On the other hand, men report that when they're with their friends, they talk more about impersonal things. They might try to make each other laugh, and that helps them feel better. Couple things here. One, when I teach social psychology, I have a slide that's very similar to this one, and I left that slide pulled up once, and it said something like men like to talk about sports, and I came back and my husband had added, and duck hunting, because my husband's a duck hunter, and I thought that it proved my point so much I left it there. So men might at least self-report that they like to talk about more impersonal topics. One of the Ice Age movies, okay, I've kind of slept through all the Ice Age movies. I don't really know, but okay. There's see, this is where you would help me if you were here. There's the saber-toothed tiger, whose name is not coming to me. And there's the woolly mammoth, Manny, maybe? I don't know. The names are not important. The point is, the saber-toothed tiger was clearly upset about something, and the wife mammoth turned to the husband mammoth and said, you need to go talk to him. And he's like, oh, I'm just going to punch him on the shoulder because that's like 6 months of therapy for men, right? Okay, so forgive my inability to come up with the movie references, but the idea is that we have a stereotype that men and women are very different here. But that's probably mostly a stereotype. How we behave, maybe, but how we behave because we think that's what we're supposed to do. They did research where they had individuals talking online, and they didn't share any information about are you male or female. They just had people talking. And they couldn't tell the difference there. So maybe when they were chatting online, and especially if there was no identifying information, they felt free to be more themselves, and people couldn't tell the difference. So maybe it's more of a social norm kind of thing. Okay. If we're going to talk about good communication, we also have to talk about how communication can go wrong and some ways that we can do better. Talking here about the person who is speaking, I love some of these terms that your textbook uses, kitchen sinking. But you know, they throw everything but the kitchen sink at it. Okay, what's happening with kitchen sinking is that we're trying intentionally to address several topics at once. Like, okay, we need to figure out: are we going to take this job? Are we going to buy this house? Are we going to have a baby? So let's sit down and figure it out. It's not a good idea. Those are all maybe related topics that maybe should all be addressed, sure, but maybe not all addressed at once. There's too many things. There's no way you're going to come to complete satisfaction about all of those topics, probably before your attention span and your patience runs out. So that would be intentionally trying to address other topics versus some couples that don't intentionally do this but accidentally do this. They kind of drift off beam. This is me. If you see those memes where they're like how ADHD people tell stories, that's me. My husband tags me and that kind of stuff. I can have difficulty sometimes, and you know this. You've been in my lectures all semester. But the idea is that for some people, it's really hard to stay on task. So making sure that we are holding each other accountable for staying on task is a good thing. But also, for the person who is listening, there are lots of traps to fall into. Talking about mind reading here, if I'm going to be honest, and this is really honest, I'm not just being honest with you guys, I'm being honest with YouTube. My husband might watch this later. This was one of the biggest mistakes that I made early on in my marriage, was expecting my husband to read my mind. What I've had to figure out is that he wants to please me, but he doesn't always know how. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do is just be really clear, like, this is what I want for my birthday, you know, or whatever, not expecting the other person to read your mind, okay? So being cautious and also not thinking that you can read the other person's mind, making sure you're listening, not assuming, okay? Because you know what happens when you assume, okay? You got that. All right, interrupting. Look, if your conversations with your partner sound like a political debate, I'm just going to go ahead and say something's wrong. Interrupting, finding fault with anything your partner is saying. Like, even if your partner makes a good point, having a tendency to say, yeah, but, and then throw something in their face. Like, yeah, okay, but remember that time you did this. Always having to be right is something that maybe feels good in the moment, but probably won't feel good long term when it causes turmoil in your relationship. Cross-complaining. Look, it's hard for a partner to go to their partner and say, hey, I have an issue, let's talk about it. That's hard. There's vulnerability there. So I think the best thing you can do is to listen to what they have to say, ask them how you can do better, and then try to do better. And then come to them with your complaint, okay? So there's something also I need to talk to you about, this thing that you do. If your partner comes to you with a complaint and you start saying, okay, fine, but you need to fix this too, or before I do that, you have to do this, you're not going to get anywhere. That's just going to escalate quickly. All right, so what do we need to do? It's so simple that I almost feel sheepish lecturing on it. But behavioral description, okay? Identifying as plainly as possible the specific behavior that bothers us. We tend to, first of all, we tend to not. I think this is a Southern thing also. We tend to not usually directly say, hey, I'm bothered by this. We tend to say, okay, well, I'm going to be passive aggressive about it, or I'm just going to not talk about it, and I'm just going to sit over here and be angry. But what can you do with that? Or sometimes we make a really blanket statement like, you're driving me crazy. Okay, I'm sorry. But specifically, what can I do? But if you tell your partner, and you can combine it with these I statements, you'll see this combination here in a second. You combine it with these I statements. What's happening here is you're saying, I feel this when you do this. Tell them exactly what it is that's bothering you. Like, I feel frustrated when you leave the laundry on the floor. I mean, I can take that and say, okay, I know what to do now. I know where you want the laundry to be put. I can fix that. But if I say, you're driving me crazy, I can't do anything with that. So being very specific. And when you start off with I, that's going to be better than starting with you. When you start with you, it sounds like an accusation. You did this. You made me feel this way. But instead saying, I feel this way, acknowledges that this is your perspective and it's meaningful to you, but it might not be the same perspective that your partner has. That's another word I love to use, is perspective. From my perspective, this is an issue we need to address. It's putting how I'm feeling out there without assuming that everyone sees the world the way I do. Right? So starting with I, letting them know how you feel, because sometimes people might say, oh, I know you want me to do that, but they don't understand how serious it is or how badly it's bothering you. So letting them know how you feel, you can combine that together into an XYZ statement. Closest thing we're going to come to a formula in this class. When you do X in situation Y, I feel Z. Now, this is a combination of the I statements and the behavioral descriptions, but we've added something here in this particular situation, because sometimes there's a behavior that's not a problem in a certain situation, but it is a problem in another situation. So maybe you can talk like that in front of my friends, but you can't talk like that in front of my family, right? Maybe that's the thing. Or you can do that at home, but you can't do that in front of my coworkers, that kind of thing. So you want to let the person know exactly what the behavior is, exactly when it's okay and when it's not okay. And if it's never okay, say that. Like, there's not a situation where I feel like that would be appropriate. Like, it's okay for you to say that. But maybe you say, that's okay, just let's don't do that at family dinner. Let's don't do that at Thanksgiving, okay? This is how I feel when you do this in this particular situation. You can do something with that information. Your partner can be accountable for changing their behavior if they know what it is that's bothering you and how it's making you feel. Now, that's what we need to do when we're speaking. Be clear, all of this. The speaker-listener technique that we talked a little bit about in our conflict slides, I think it was. But with active listening, when you're the person who is being spoken to, you have to A, understand what your partner is saying, but then B, also let your partner know that you understand what they're saying. And these are two different tasks, and sometimes people are not good at this. Maybe you're really trying to listen, but your partner doesn't realize you're trying to listen. And then your partner gets frustrated at you, even though you are trying. Or sometimes people are really good at saying, yeah, oh, tell me more about that. And they're not really listening at all. You might get away with that in the moment, but then later your partner will realize when your behavior doesn't change or when you don't understand what they're talking about later that you really weren't listening. So active listening, avoid distractions, make eye contact, ask appropriate follow-up questions. All of these things we need to do. Now, as far as those appropriate follow-up questions, what you can do here is paraphrasing and perception checking. I'm going to go ahead and say that you should practice these now on your roommates, your friends, your family, romantic partners if you have one. I'm going to also say that you need to be practicing now because if you're going to be a psychologist, you're going to use these. You're going to need to use these. I think probably many careers you're going to need these, but especially psychology, if you're doing counseling, that kind of thing. So paraphrasing is repeating a message in your own words. That does two things. One, that shows the person that you really were listening. You're not just parroting back exactly what they said, but you're processing what they said, and you're able to put it in your own words. But the other thing is that it allows the speaker to say, no, I know you're trying, that's not exactly what I meant though. And that leads into perception checking. You can say, okay, I think I understand. Is this what you're trying to say? It sounds to me like you're worried about this. Is that correct? Can you tell me? Or just say, can you give me an example of when you felt that way? Or can you give me an example of specifically how that made you feel? Or can you give me an example of how I could do that better? So perception checking allows you to adjust what you're hearing to be more accurate by getting extra information from the person who's speaking. And doesn't that feel good when someone's talking to you or I guess if you're talking to someone else rather, if you're talking to someone else and they're asking questions, follow-up questions, that really feels good because they care and they're paying attention, right? So this is a way to understand what they're saying and to communicate that you are understanding. Now, it is natural that there will be times when this process is hard. And some of those times can be avoided. Like being sober is probably a good idea. And we can try to avoid being intoxicated if that causes problems. But what about being sick? What about being angry? What about being tired? We can't avoid all of those things. So I think we should be aware of our triggers. Like, I'm really not in the mood to talk right now. If we're able to politely put off a conversation for a little bit until we've had a nap or a snack or whatever, that's a good thing. If not, just being extra aware of what you're saying in that particular moment, right? You need to find a way to calm yourself down. This will be helpful with your partners, but this will be helpful with everybody. You need to find a way to calm yourself down when your boss upsets you or when the person in Walmart upsets you. You have to find a way to calm yourself down. In grad school, we did a group therapy where we were working with young males that were having some like aggression issues and talking about how to stay calm, how to make good decisions when you're upset. These are things that I think most of us could benefit from, right? Deep breathing. Progressive muscle relaxation. Go to your happy place, right? All right, now, some things to think about when you're perhaps having some problems having calm communication. One thing, it's very tempting, especially if you're upset, especially if your partner has hurt you, to attribute hostile intent. Remember we talked about attributions, your understanding of the cause of something. If you make an attribution that your partner did this intentionally, then you will treat them differently. Perhaps we should give them the grace and we should give them time and space to explain themselves instead of automatically assuming that they did it on purpose or that they will always behave this way. I want to be cautious with this one. I think that what we should get from this is you should keep an open line of communication. You should not let things bottle up. You should have a method of calmly, politely letting your partner know how you feel about certain things. I think this could easily go wrong, though. You can't really believe what you watch in reality TV, but there was a TV show I watched once on TLC, My 5 Wives, which was just like it sounded. It was a polygamous family. They were one husband, 5 wives. And, you know, it's a reality TV show, so it was probably all staged, but there was this episode where they were having safe talks. The husband had gotten the idea that his wives were having problems with each other, and so he came up with this rule: whenever one wife needs to talk to another, she can declare a safe talk. And then that means that the other wife has to listen to her and not get upset about it. Well, I don't think in any situation, and maybe especially that situation, you should tell another person that they're not allowed to get upset. So I would be cautious. I think there's a wrong way to do this, but I also think there is a right way to do this. If you get upset and things are escalating, stop it. I know you've got that comeback that would win, especially if you know this person really well. You could throw it up in their face, and it might feel good in the moment. It won't feel good later. So instead, take a break, take a time out, take a nap, eat a snack, whatever you need to do. I'm not talking about a Ross and Rachel timeout, like, you know, anyway, you get the point. But I'm saying that you should have a few minutes to calm down first before you get back to that conversation. Just deep breathing. It sounds really simple, and it is simple, but it's true that when you force your body to breathe slowly, it will calm down your body. It will help you feel more relaxed. Okay. Lastly here, I think that there is a lot of power in validation. There are some topics where this is all you need. To say, you know what? I hear your opinion, I acknowledge your opinion, and your opinion is just as valid as mine, even if I don't agree with it. Even if I see things a different way, I still value you, and I value your right to have an opinion. I think we've lost this ability in our culture. I think it's sad that we tend to think that if a person disagrees with us, then we can't have a good relationship with them. I think we have to learn how to validate each other. Having said that, in a romantic relationship, there may be some subjects where you can't do this. Like, if you're trying to decide, are we going to move or not? Are we going to have a baby or not? Or whatever. You can't just say, well, we're just going to agree to disagree. Sometimes a decision has to be made. But you can still use validation in the meantime. I hear what you had to say, and it matters to me. And that might be a good starting point of respect and being on the same page. But sometimes you have to move forward beyond this and get to a place where you do agree. But sometimes you don't. Sometimes just saying, you know what, we can agree to disagree and still care about each other, that may be the very best thing that you can do. All right. So that is the end of this lecture video, which is for the week of March 30th. So don't forget to be completing your activities. You do get 2 drop grades for activities, though, so bear that in mind. Which means if you've gotten all the points on 1 through 10, you don't have to do 11 and 12. Or if you've just missed one, then you can use one other drop grade. You get 2 drop grades to use as you wish. Email me if you have questions about that. Also, make sure that you have taken or do take exam 3 before it closes at 5 p.m. on March 31st, I believe. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you guys later.